Hi, we pick up the story in 1 Samuel 4 today after last session's overview of 1 Samuel 1 to 7 and the various links with the past in the book of Judges, at least the past in terms of the chronology, we read it in straight order, and the various issues that are arising in relation to these chapters and the ones that follow in the first book of Samuel and the second book of Samuel. Today we're going to focus on a short overview of just these chapters 4 to 7 before we launch into this first scene. So just to remember what we looked at last time in this whole unit from 1 Samuel 1 to 7. There it says 1 Samuel 7, but it really is 1 to 7. The central question is who is to lead Yahweh's people Israel, and what role does Samuel have in this? And I just want to focus again on this first part of this, the leadership options of judges, priests, prophets, kings, or Yahweh alone. And Samuel's role, as you can see there, as a judge, which we won't see in this section, but later in chapter 7, as a priest, as a prophet, which we'll see aborted here in relation to kings in chapter 8 and in relation to Yahweh alone in chapter 7. Those are the primary themes throughout this whole unit. And in our session today, we're going to be focusing on this first part there, chapter 4, verse 1 to 10. But I wanted you to be able to hear this in connection with this whole unit here, because after the first three chapters dealt with Hannah and the birth of Samuel and Eli's not listening either to Hannah or aware really of who Samuel was, now it shifts away from them, although not quite yet, as we'll see today and in the next session, to highlight the question of Yahweh alone. And so some of this is very humorous, as we'll see here. For those not used to considering the Bible to be funny, I hope you'll be able to open yourself to that. There's no reason to presuppose the Bible's not funny, and often it's funny for the reason that people of color or other oppressed people often use comedy to mock the pretensions of those who would oppress them or claim superiority over them. So the Israelites here in relation to the Philistines, but also self-mockery, as we'll see a number of times throughout this. Just to go quickly over this section so we can see where our passage today fits. So today we'll see the Israelites go into battle and lose, and the death of Eli's sons Hophni and Phinehas, and then the death of Eli himself, as we see in the next section, 4:11 to 22. Then, without any priest to guide them, and without Samuel, the ark is taken by the Philistines into the house of Dagon, their chief deity, and Dagon is dismembered, and then eventually the hilarious scene of the ark causing tumors, or in some translations, hemorrhoids in Philistine territory. In other words, Yahweh is a pain in the ass to the Philistines, in the most literal sense. And then to keep the humor going, we'll see the Philistine priests and diviners decide that their plan is to make little images of the hemorrhoids and of the mice that ravage the land, and then the humor continuing in chapter 6, verse 12 to 18, as the ark led by two milk cows goes to the house of the sun and stops on its own. And then the ark will return to the people of Israel, who will also plague. And then finally the ark will be done for now, and Samuel will come back on the scene, and there will be peace. And so we'll see the ark here representing both the power of God in a way, but also the question of Yahweh alone, as we'll see. So, as we begin to look in this passage, I'm going to bring the atlas up here so you can see the various places that are described. I have on the screen on the left, you see the end of chapter 3, where it says, all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was a trustworthy prophet. Dan and Beersheba are not on this map. Dan is to the far north, and that represents the extent of the Israelite territory, and Beersheba is down in the south, 7 wells. But we'll also see a number of other places, Shiloh and Ebenezer and Aphek and others. So there are some of those places, as you can see, that are Philistine territory along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, with the Judahites and the Benjaminites and the Ephraimites being a little more inland along the Jordan Valley there to the east. So that's where we'll be as we take up today. So let's begin looking back a little bit at chapter 3, verse 20 and 21 before we jump into chapter 4. So two things to pay attention to here. The narrator tells us that everybody knew that Samuel was a trustworthy prophet, or here, if we look at the Hebrew Naaman, a sure prophet. So there's no question that not only has Yahweh made Samuel a prophet, but everybody knows that. And further, the narrator continues that Lord or Yahweh continued to appear at Shiloh, and that, of course, as we saw from the very first chapter of 1 Samuel, where Hannah and Elkanah were brought the baby bet the baby Samuel to Eli the priest, where he was ministering there in Shiloh. And so Samuel is still there, and Yahweh is continuing to appear at Shiloh, for Yahweh revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. So those two verses set us up for the fact that we have a trustworthy prophet, and God's word is available through Samuel. And chapter 4 starts with, and the word of Samuel came to all Israel, and then is completely ignored. So there's a couple questions of sentence construction and grammar here that I want to look at. As you can see from my notes, Samura says we should translate it this way as a single sentence. Around the time when the word of Samuel spread through Israel, Israel marched out, etc. Or as Bodner and others suggest, and the word of God was for all Israel, now Israel marched out in battle. So we can hear it as continuous, or we can hear it as the New RSV as separated out with a period there. The word of God came to all Israel, but it's not listened to. And so we'll see how that goes as we continue here. Frank Spina here in my note down below notes that this verse is central, a central introduction to prophetic speech, which then does not happen. Instead, the people go to war without listening to Samuel, to their loss. And Samuel will be gone from the scene until chapter 7. Where he is, we don't know. The narrator or the writer has put him off screen. Whether he's watching all this or just waiting to be called on, we'll see eventually in chapter 7. So the word is there to be heard, but not to be paid attention to. And so in those days, the Philistines mustered for war against Israel. Israel went out to battle against them. The issue here is not the specifics of war. The war is really a mechanical prop in the story to highlight the bigger issue. So we're not dealing with history here, any particular battle. There's no reason for the battle named here. It's just a series of battles and the question of who can help. Recall that in the book of Judges, often, but not always, God's Spirit came upon someone to lead them in battle. But we'll hear that later that Samuel as a judge never leads in battle. And here he's not named as a judge, but as a prophet. So they encamp at Ebenezer, which means helpstone, and the Philistines camped at Aphek, which is an Israelite territory. You can see it on the map there, just on the edge, and so it's an incursion. And so the Philistines draw up in line, and the battle is joined. Israel is defeated, and they killed about 4,000. These are just round numbers, not meant to convey facts, but the tide of what's going on. So when the troops came to the camp, the elders of Israel, and this is the first time now we're seeing the elders separated out. You can see in the note below that they appear a number of times. We've seen all Israel, and we'll see all Israel again, or we've seen groups of tribal members, Ephraim or Benjamin or Judah or others. But this is the first time we've had a sense that there's a group called elders of Israel who have some kind of authority, although what exact authority isn't named. So the elders of Israel said, and it's not clear who they're saying it to each other, to other Israelites, to God, it doesn't say. Why has Yahweh put us to rout today before the Philistines? And note what's already being named. They're attributing the loss to Yahweh's failure to support them. They could have attributed it to military failure or other things, but they put the theological explanation on it. Or perhaps better put, the author has put the theological explanation on it. And the theological explanation is wanting. They don't know why Yahweh would have done that. And so the response, again, is not to call upon Yahweh, not to seek Yahweh's word, not to talk to Samuel, but to bring the Ark of the Covenant from Shiloh. And so we need to look at a couple of things here. Here's the first time the Ark is appearing here, but it's important that we see that the last time it appeared near the end of Judges, we saw this exact opposite kind of thing. So let's look at that briefly here. So we see in Judges 20:27 to 28, this passage. And the Israelites inquired of Yahweh, for the ark of the covenant of God was there in those days. And Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, ministered before it in those days, saying, Shall we go out once more to battle against our kinsfolk the Benjaminites, or shall we desist? And Yahweh answered, Go up, for tomorrow I will give them into your hand. And so what we see there is the ark is mentioned, and it's mentioned in the context of Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, and in the context here of Phinehas, son of Eli, but it's not the ark itself that matters. What matters is the people ask for Yahweh's direction, and Yahweh gives them the direction to continue in the war. So the ark is mentioned there as a symbol, but back in our passage in 1 Samuel 3, it seems that they believe that the ark itself will be the key to victory, and it's not a magic box that like a genie in a bottle where you can rub on it and Yahweh will come out, as we'll see. So they say, let us bring, and really it's let us take. And take is a key word both in these passages and then throughout this entire section, and it'll especially be a key word in chapter 8 when Samuel teaches the people what the life under a king will be like. And you can see in my note below from Samora, the collocation take plus the ark is a key phrase in the narrative, and you see how many times it's used there. Alter notes that let us take to us the ark. In the quote from him, you see the elders arrogate to themselves a sacred object for their own purposes, conceiving the ark magically or fetishistically as a vehicle of power that they can manipulate for material ends. So in other words, they're not looking for a king or a judge or even priestly leadership. They're just looking for magical leadership, and it'll fail them. So they asked to take the Ark of the Covenant here, where they are in Aphek, where they are in the battle at Ebenezer, from Shiloh, so he may come among us and save us from the power of our enemies. So it's Yahweh they believe will save them, but somehow they think the Ark is this magic box, but it's not. So the people send to Shiloh. And Shiloh, as we saw, was associated with Samuel, so it's another reference that we should expect that Samuel would be in the message here, but he's not. And so they brought the ark, and this time the covenant of, the Ark of the Covenant of Yahweh of Hosts, a different title, who is enthroned on the cherubim, an unusual image for this section here from Exodus 25 we see there, and it'll be echoed at 2 Samuel 6:2. But it's a strange thing to have in this point, because plainly enthroned on the cherubim is a function of the royal stature in the Jerusalem temple, way later in the story. So the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the Ark of the Covenant of God. And we've already seen that they were corrupt, that we've already seen that they were eating the best meat from the sacrifices and such. So they're there with the Ark, but they're not doing anything. They're not expressing any leadership. They're just there. And so as we continue down, when the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord came into the camp, all Israel gave a mighty shout. It's a battle cry. Notice the Ark still isn't doing anything. All they're doing is shouting loud. And the Philistines hear the noise of the shout, and they said, "What does this great shouting in the camp of the Hebrews mean?" And this is the first time we're hearing Hebrews, and important to at least note the very complex argument of one of my favorite scholars, who I've mentioned in other of these videos, Meyer Sternberg, whose picture you can see there, and his book Hebrews Between Cultures, which is an extremely long, erudite, but amazing tour de force through the language of Ibri, which is the Hebrew for Hebrew, in the Hebrew Bible. And he highlights in ways that I hate to reduce to a sentence or two, but unless you want to read a 1,000-page long book or so, it's going to have to be that Hebrew is an ethnic slur word when used by others. The Israelites and the narrator refer to the people, as we just saw, as the Israelites. So Hebrews basically saying crossers, much like the denigration of Mexican or other Latin American immigrants across the Rio Grande at the southern U.S. border as wetbacks, that having to cross the river to enter in. Hebrews are crossers, people who've moved from one place to another, and implying that they're in a place that isn't their own. There's a couple of times where Israelites refer to each other as Hebrews, much like many ethnic groups can use ethnic slur words amongst themselves, but we'll see how that has a different function later. So the Philistines denigrating their opponents here by calling them crossers, and trying to wonder what this means. So just as the Israelites wondered, why have the Philistines routed us, now the Philistines wonder what the meaning of the shouting is. And they learned that the Ark of the Lord had come to the camp. We don't know how that. Notice now it's Ark of Yahweh and not Ark of the Covenant, or Ark of the Covenant of Yahweh of Hosts. There's a number of different names for it as we go through. And the Philistines were afraid, and we don't see that very often, and it'll be reversed in 7:7. But it's rare that we see the Philistines afraid. And what is it they're afraid of exactly? All there is shouting, and they learn there's an ark there. Why should they be afraid of the ark? They've not had an experience with it before. So it's a curious thing that the narrators are writing it. The Philistines are afraid of this box. In the next chapter, we'll see the ark up against the statue of their god Dagon, but that's for the next chapter. Philistines are afraid, and they say, gods have come into the camp, expressing their native polytheism, and they say it more than once here. So, gods have come to this camp, and woe to us, for nothing like this has happened before. Literally from the Hebrew, nothing like this has happened yesterday or the day before yesterday. And they say, woe to us again. And so we hear this huge outcry from the Philistines. And as Brueggemann highlights in the note below, the Philistines are presented as superb interpreters of the history and faith of Israel, although they make some mistakes in it as well. And Robert Alter also notes below, here as elsewhere in the Bible, the national fiction is maintained that all the people of Canaan were intimately familiar with the Exodus story and deeply impressed by it. And of course, another piece of that national fiction here is that the Philistines can speak Hebrew, which is the language that this is written in, but that's hidden from us behind the English, which of course none of the people of that time spoke. So their second woe to us, who can save us from the power of these mighty gods? In other words, the Philistines cry out to be saved or delivered from the power of Yahweh. Elohim, which is plural, could be what they're hearing there as multiple gods. And they highlight, these are the gods who struck the Egyptians with every sort of plague in the wilderness. The word for plague here, Makkah, can also mean slaughter, so it doesn't necessarily mean like a physical illness or plague. It could also mean just they struck them down. But of course, Yahweh did not strike down the Egyptians in the wilderness, but in Egypt. And so it's a mistake in their understanding of it, but that's how things happen, isn't it? I wonder how many U.S. Americans could narrate the facts of our history in a way that was accurate, let alone outsiders. Maybe the outsiders often know it better, but that's a question for another context, isn't it? So take courage and be men, O Philistines, in order not to become slaves to the Hebrews as they have been to you. Be men and fight. So they give themselves a cheerleading talk. Note that they're not appealing to their gods directly. They're not appealing to their priestly elite as they will later. Just a pep talk to have them have courage and go out there. So the Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated, and they fled, everyone to his home, and there was a great slaughter, for there fell of Israel 30,000 foot soldiers. In other words, the ark did not save them. Not only did the ark not save them, it was taken. Captured here, missing the fact that we're hearing again the Hebrew look for take here, and you see in my note 8 times from this verse till 5:3, just a few verses down. So the image of taking used throughout. The ark of God was taken, and the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died. It doesn't say how they died, presumably by the slaughter of the Philistines, but they're gone. They contributed nothing to the story, and now they're gone. And so now that's where we're going to stop for today. But a couple of things to draw this section together here. Here I want to put up this image from Psalm 78, which has to do with Shiloh here, because Shiloh appears to be taken in this. And this image from the Psalm suggests even if the passage in 1 Samuel is a fictionalized, stylized story to highlight other themes, there does seem to be some sense of Shiloh having been abandoned, and you see that in this passage. He abandoned his dwelling at Shiloh, the tent where he dwelt among mortals, and delivered his power to captivity, his glory to the hand of the foe. He gave his people to the sword and vented his wrath on his heritage. Fire devoured their young men, and their girls had no marriage song. Their priests fell by the sword, and their widows made no lamentation. Then the Lord awoke us from sleep like a warrior shouting because of wine. He put his adversaries to rout. He put them to everlasting disgrace. He rejected the tent of Joseph. He did not choose the tribe of Ephraim, but he chose the tribe of Judah, Mount Zion, which he loves. He built his sanctuary like the high heavens, like the earth, which he has founded forever. And you might be surprised by those last verses. What does rejecting the tent of Joseph and not choosing Ephraim and choosing Judah have to do with abandoning Shiloh and the power of God? And it has to do with a theme that's hidden behind the passage we looked at and will be coming up here, which is, we'll call it the North versus South theme, or the Judah versus Benjamin theme that was at the end of the book of Judges, and will come up again when we see Saul representing Benjamin and later David representing Judah as competing for the monarchy. And so we see in this psalm the idea of rejecting Ephraim and choosing Judah, Mount Zion, which of course is where Jerusalem and the temple will be. So part of this may be a reflection of the southern view that the monarchy should be in Jerusalem, and that's where the temple of Yahweh should be. But there's also an element of something else, that maybe the monarchy itself is not the solution to this problem. Maybe listening to Yahweh and relying on Yahweh alone is the solution. And we'll pick it up there when the man from Benjamin runs from the battle line and the house of Eli's demise is completed. See you then. Bye-bye.